one of the problems with each of these management regimes was that they were based on partial knowledge, they were based on expert opinion, and experts who said, well, I know the problem, I know what needs to be done to fix it. They weren't based on models that recognise that change was important, and that as broad an understanding of the system as you can have, it actually helped you design a different system. So from that sort of descriptive work, then you go on to develop a model of the system dynamics, identifying thresholds of potential concern, as we've talked about, the alternate stable states and the transition phases, as we've talked about, cross-scale interactions. I haven't mentioned that before directly, but that is those interactions that occur across different levels of scale. One of the biggest problems with a lot of modern environmental management is that people don't recognize those cross-scale interactions and the kinds of effects that they can have on their system. And then you build this conceptual model. This is the adaptive cycle applied to a forest system in Alaska. So it's in the 1900s to 1948, the logging industry was established for timber and pulp. Exploitation phase, very rapid growth in response to demand following World War II. Conservation phase in the late 70s to 1990. They were searching for stability in response to globalization, environmentalism, and policy reform. So they were trying to stabilize it, but in fact the bigger system within which this forest industry operated was changing quite dramatically around them. And they weren't able to bring it off, so the system collapsed. And that story is relevant to a lot of forests in the US system. I'm actually working with a forest community now in Oregon, which is still in a state of collapse 20 years later. So this is a system, the system I'm working with is a system caught in the poverty trap. They're trying all kinds of different things, but their primary source of livelihood are those forests, and those forests are actually now a deteriorating asset. This is an example of a state in transition model. This model was actually developed in collaboration between scientists and local stakeholders to show how different management interventions lead to different system states. So mechanical destruction, grazing, and so on. So the small arrows here show the transitions from one state to another. The big arrows are showing the management interventions that lead to those. So if you've got that kind of understanding, then it's very easy for you to say, well, out of these various alternate states and various transitions, this is the one that I like the most, and this is the way we can change the way we manage the system to keep it in its desired state. This is another state of transition model, woody cover, grass composition, erosion. It's a very general rangeland model that can be used to build a quantitative model of the system dynamics. Okay, this is the one from Australia that we've already looked at. Thresholds of potential concern. Yeah. And then this is taking the next kind of resilience assessment, which is an assessment of general resilience. Now, general resilience is a set of attributes that will enhance the resilience of the system. It doesn't matter whether it's close to a threshold or not. If you want to change a system, then you would deliberately engineer transformation, and then you would do whatever you could to enhance these attributes within that system to ensure that it stayed in that transformed state. If you like the kind of system where you're already in, but you're concerned about its resilience, these are the things that you would do to enhance its resilience so that it would be better able to remain within that state in the face of disturbances and shocks. There's a couple of things about this. I put these models in here just to show you how they are in fact all related to the resilience models. But you don't need to understand system dynamics to do an assessment like this. It's a very simple, straightforward thing to do. Just draw up a list of attributes and have a discussion about what is the status of my system in relation to these attributes, and what direction is that attribute going? Is it getting better or is it going worse? That's dead basic. Then you can take that to the next level and think about, well, if it's changing with regard to that attribute, what is driving the change? And what might inhibit that change? The minute you start doing that, then you're actually moving from a static assessment to developing an understanding of the dynamics of the system. A lot of people look at all the dynamic stuff and say, oh no, this is far too complicated, we don't want to do it. But if you start with this, it's one way of getting into it in a gentler way, and it's something that you can apply almost immediately. Those of you who are interested in taking out the field and giving it a go. Very straightforward thing to do. I won't go into these in great detail. Because we've mentioned them in one way or another, I think. Innovation, we've talked about further. Openness is something we haven't mentioned. And that's to do with the ability of the system to learn from other places in terms of human knowledge, in terms of new ideas, in terms of new genetic resources. If you've got a completely closed system, eventually whatever it's got in it is going to shrink in terms of its ability to respond to change. But if you've got an open system, giving and receiving new knowledge, new genetic information, then it's going to be more resilient. System reserves we didn't talk about specifically, but it again it goes to those capitals, having things set by in case of hard times so that you get going. Equity is extraordinarily important. One of the reasons that we've got a lot of poverty in some parts of the world, a lot of rigidity in other parts of the world, is because of the lack of equity. Within complex systems thinking, there's this thing known as the trap of success to the successful. So successful people have the ability to do things which bring more success. So they tend to become very rich and accumulate a lot of resources. And once they get to that situation, they're up here. And they don't want to change, they don't want to give it up. But in order to become rich to that extent, they have to be taking resources from somewhere else in the system. So somebody is ending up with poor. And if you think about the wave of change that's gone on through the Middle East, it's still going. A lot of that is about people who've been stuck in a poverty trap revolting against people who've been built in the system. Humility, that's a new one that came out in Brian Walker's book. And that's basically about recognizing that we don't really know very much about the systems that we live within. We might think we know, we might think that technology is going to provide us with all the answers. But in fact, we've got a great deal more to learn. And then the importance of slow variables we talked about. Modularity, we talked about that in terms of guilds of species, for example. We didn't talk about it much in terms of over-connected systems, but if you think about the world's commodity markets and the world's financial markets, those are very good examples of over-connected systems. Think about what happens to the price of oil when war breaks out somewhere. It just shoots up. Think about what happens to the price of food. Prices go up and down very dramatically. So a lot of human activity is run or revolves around these global commodity markets, financial markets, and they're actually very, very unstable. Something needs to be done to try and break them down into more modular units, but of course, the people who operate those systems don't want to do that. Tight feedbacks, that's all about having a good governance system. think of a steering system on a car. If all the links in the system are loose and you try to turn right because you need to turn right quickly, and the bits are all loose, you won't be able to do it. You'll carry on straight and you want to turn. So it's exactly that kind of thing. Type feedbacks give you the mechanisms you need to guide the system. Overlapping governance. That's particularly important for fugitive resources, like migratory birds, like large animals that migrate over a big distance, oceanic fisheries, river systems, and so on. You've got to have ways of managing that resource across multiple levels of scale, which requires overlapping governance. Making sure that ecosystem services are properly valued. There's a question of equity, which we just talked about. That's also relevant to connectedness and openness, which we've already talked about. So that's a simple assessment which gives you a very good idea of the state of the system in terms of its resilience. And this is just the text which I've already spoken to. Okay, then from there it goes on to a governance assessment, and I'm not going to go into that. But this is the all-important who's designing the rules and regulations that actually determine the way what the system may or may not do. Who's making the decisions, who's affected by those decisions, how many people are breaking the rules, what are the consequences of the rule breaking, and so on. And then network analysis is a way of getting at that, looking at individuals, looking at the links between individuals and organizations. It's very important in terms of social learning. Then you come up with a management strategy, model of system change, is transformation necessary, bounce back or bounce forward, and then strategies to enhance the capacity of the system. Okay, then there are some really important caveats that go with this. Efforts to increase the resilience of one part of the system may reduce resilience of other parts, so there are trade-offs to consider between resilience at different levels of scale. It may be necessary to maintain general resilience to cope with emerging evolutionary problems while addressing specified resilience by managing thresholds. So you may well have to do both simultaneously. And no panacea blueprints or silver bullets, simply a framework for planning, management, adaptation, and learning. The adaptation and the social learning that follows after a resilience assessment is really the most important part of it. If you do an assessment and then don't do the adaptive management, don't do the social learning, you're probably wasting your time. And then in the social context, this question of what is a desirable system is a value judgment. We saw in the Goulburn broken catchment how human values have shaped that whole landscape and made it what it is today. So if people from one culture want it in one way, and you've got people sharing the same landscape with a different set of values, they're going to have a different understanding of how the system works and what's good and what's not good. So that can make life a little trickier as a facilitator in the resilience assessment. Critical issue of powers, equity and politics. No reason for the state to abrogate its responsibilities. And there's quite a lot of that going on now. As economic hardship bites, the state's backing away from some of its responsibilities. The UK particularly driving in that direction at the moment. They're saying to local authorities, well, we can't afford to do it, you get on and sort it out. And that's not resilience. Delineation of system boundaries may lead to exclusionary practices, yeah. I think that's very obvious. And this little cartoon here is a very good metaphor for a non-resilient system. Okay. There's all the references for those. So just quickly, any questions? If there aren't any questions, then we go on to the next bit, which is a movie that Mburu here stars in. We're going to run through the movie, and then you're going to use that as as a system to think about, as a system that's gone through a process of change. And when you think about it and then start to apply some of these new ideas that you've learned or heard about today to that system. And Ru's here to answer all your questions because he's the local expert. Would you like to stand up and introduce yourself, please? And thank you for coming too.
Hello, my name is Abdul Buru. I work with the African Biodiversity Network based in Kenya. We work in 11 countries with about 36 organizations. Basically what we do a lot is not resilience science per se, but basically processes with communities that enhance or support resilience, as we came to learn from Mike Jones when we met him a couple of years ago. And he asked that we do that collaborative work, not to be collaborative, but to have him test the kind of work we do through his work in resilience science. And we are coming to learn that they are actually, those two processes are working very, very closely. And yeah, so thanks so much.
So just quickly before I turn this off and put the movie on, are there any questions that come out of that very quick presentation of an assessment manual that's about 50 pages long? Or can I leave you to dig into that later at your leisure?
They can always email you.
Yeah, they can. And in fact, the Resilience Alliance runs a section on its website for questions and answers about resilience assessment, which has been dormant for a while. So it's time we have lots of keen practitioners pestering the experts for information about how to do the work.
Let's go to the movies.
Okay. Can you set up the movie? Yeah. Okay, so this is a film based on some of the work that Nguru did in Kenya. The film was made by the Gaia Foundation and the Africa Biodiversity Network.
The farmers here were encouraged to grow tea for foreign export over 50 years ago, and so indigenous crops and farming methods were replaced as households began growing less food of their own. Now, the community finds itself firmly positioned at the bottom of an unreliable the market and absolutely rely on the cash they make from tea. Food security has become a perennial problem for the people here. And as the drought continues, the scale of the problem is worsening. Gafuru Mburu was born in this area, and in 2007, with his organization ICE, the Institute of Culture and Ecology, he initiated a series of local discussions with the aim of stimulating radical change led by the community.
After finishing my education, I went to work in Nairobi, but I have been coming to visit my parents, to visit friends, to visit relatives, but the same problems that I've been seeing are